What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another video. In today's video, we are back with another free agency update for the Detroit Lions, but there's a little bit more than that in today's video. We're also going to be diving a little bit into the defensive side of the ball, kind of, I guess you could say, getting our feet wet, taking a look at the Lions defenses, how it's starting to kind of shape together after the most recent signing of Chauncey Gardner-Johnson last night to a one-year deal. So we're going to tie that in. I'm going to give you some of my thoughts on how I kind of see this defense coming together, how that could affect the draft, what I think they would still be wanting to add to this defense, and also making some comparisons as well. On top of that, we're also going to be updating the Lions' current salary cap situation based on some of the contract updates that we now have and we don't have. Let's get it started. Welcome everybody to our video. Glad you guys are here. And yes, man, we are back with another Lions video. And before we get into that defensive talk, because, you know, it's just one of those videos, I've done these before where sometimes they're accurate, sometimes they're not accurate, okay? I say, like, I think it may be going this direction, then it goes a completely different direction. That's very possible, again, with this video. But what it does for me is it gets me thinking, trying to put pieces to the puzzle together, be like, all right, how does this make sense? How is this going to fit for the Lions? And just kind of projecting how I think things may go together, because of course that's going to affect when I do mock drafts, what I think the Lions are going to be looking for when it comes to the draft, based on how I think they're putting together the team. And today we're specifically going to be looking at the defensive side of the ball. Now, before we get to that, I first want to start off with some of these salary cap updates, because today the Lions basically got a pay cut done with a player that we didn't really ever bring up. I mean, we talked about potentially cutting him as well as potentially cutting a Big V, but we always talked about, man, if we get a pay cut with Big V, keep him around because his cap number so high, considering that he's a guard and that he was signed for a tackle deal. But the other player who we're going to talk about today, Romeo Okwara, we never really brought up the potential of a pay cut there, but that actually happened. It opened up tons of cap space for the Lions, so we'll go through that as well. But firstly, just to kind of fly through these, we have Michael Badgley. We have his contract details. He's got a one-year deal with the Lions. This was our kicker from this past year. As I said, I would not be shocked the Lions still drafted a kicker, added someone for competition with potentially a bigger leg than Badgley, but he was actually pretty good for us last season, for 20 for 24 on his field goals, made every extra point he took. And as you can see, his cap number is just over $1 million, pushing $1.1 million. It's actually the same cap number as our long snapper, Jake McQuaid, who we signed last night, which we'll take a look at. The difference between him, however, and Jake McQuaid is that he has a little bit more guarantees in his deal. You can see the dead cap, if he was cut, would be $350K. It's not to say that you can't get out of this deal if you wanted to, and someone else won the job and he brought in competition and someone else took that job, but it's got a little bit more guarantees than what we have with McQuaid. Jake McQuaid, the long snapper. Now this one is, you got to keep in mind, the Lions had the best, or one of the best, special teams units last season. They've had one of the best for the last few years, so, you know, you got to continue to add a competition. Even though we don't talk about long snapper, you got to have competition there. Scott Daly is under contract as well. He was tendered as an exclusive rights free agent, so there's no guarantees that if you cut Scott Daly, who would be coming back for another year, that you would lose anything, because there's no guarantees to his deal. But similar situation here with McQuaid. It's a little bit different because we're signing him as an unrestricted free agent. However, McQuaid, whose cap number is the same as Michael Badgley, has less guarantees in his deal. You can see only $152K is guaranteed, meaning that if he was cut, there really wouldn't be much dead cap at all, and you would almost save all of that money back if he was cut. So we're really not locked into either one of our current two long snappers. It'll just be a battle to see who's going to win that role, right? The two-time Pro Bowler, which, by the way, doesn't really mean anything to me, especially for long snapper. It's not like the people that are voting on Pro Bowl long snappers are watching the long snapper like, did you see that snap last week, my boy? Hey, he's texting his friends. Did you just see that? And that's no hate to the long snapper. Did add competition there. Now, with that being said, when you take a Lions salary cap calculator, according to Over the Cap, you can see the cap number is higher than what we saw last time, now at $26.7 million. Like, what the heck is going on there? Why is our cap space so high? Well, as I touched on, this does not include Romeo Moseley yet. It also does not include Graham Glasgow yet. And it also does not include the most recent signing in Gardner-Johnson either. So those are three deals that will probably impact this. Graham Glasgow was originally signed to a one-year, $4.5 million deal is what was reported. You had Moseley, one-year, $6 million deal is what was reported. And Gardner-Johnson, one-year, $8 million deal, which is what was reported. And because they're only one-year deals, they're more difficult kind of to backload unless you throw void years on the deal, because they're not actually under contract any longer than that one season. So those cap numbers, I'm going to assume, are going to be a little pricey for the Lions. They're going to impact this for sure once we get those updates. However, the one move that did open up a lot of cap space for the Lions, and it was something that I brought up in last night's video, is I was like, hey, I'm going to keep my eye on if a cut happens, you know, one of these guys gets cut after seeing that move for Gardner-Johnson, after seeing that signing. And instead of a cut, the Lions actually saved more cap space by getting a pay cut done. Now, of course, both sides have to agree to this, but getting a pay cut done with Romeo Okwara. That's right. A big pay cut done with Romeo Okwara. So as you can see, the big difference here, and it's not, you know, a restructure, because the big difference that you see, somewhat similar to what we did with Charles Harris, but not exactly. Bring that up because if you notice the cap savings, you would actually be losing money by a cut, because now his base salary is so low, and that was what a lot of the saving would have came from in a cut scenario. So that's why to bring that up, because now he's kind of locked in a sense. Oh, there are bonuses to his contract, as you can see, per game roster bonuses that were thrown into his deal to potentially earn some more with the Detroit Lions. But the big difference here is that cap number. It is now at $5.647 million. And I know you can't see the before, but before his cap hit was set at $14.5 million. Plus you had the void year, which he still has on his deal. So that didn't change. None of that changed, but his cap number dropped huge. Okay, it was, I believe it was $11 million in base salary, and now it has dropped down to $2 million in base salary. So they basically just took a massive pay cut from his base salary. Now, the Lions, again, could have looked to like restructure that, but it would have been difficult, and I brought this up before, because of the fact that he had no years left on his deal. So all your restructuring would do is split it evenly between this year and his void year. So you would just be making the void year very big, and of course, he's not under contract. So if you just let him walk and you put, say, I don't know, $8 million on his void year, then you're just paying that to nobody. That's a pretty big dead cap for one player, right? That's a lot. So it was kind of weird to try to restructure, but the Lions came to an agreement, I guess, to have a pay cut, and the Lions opened up about $9 million in cap space, which is massive. That is a massive saving. And as I said, there's still rumors about DJ Chark coming to Detroit. It may now be possible. We're just going to have to, again, kind of see where those cap numbers fall into play. But especially after that Gardner-Johnson move, I was like, something feels like it's got to happen here. And that's what happened. So for the Lions, it's great because it actually opens up more cap space than it would have from just cutting the guy. And at the same time, we get to keep Romeo around. I think it's understandable, right, from the outside perspective looking in, because I didn't think he looked right last year. It's why I cut him in my mock off season, but it still feels weird to cut him because his brother Julian's here. I know it just feels weird. I know it happens, but it feels weird. And also on top of that, if he came back and looked like himself when he got that contract extension, he would fill a really nice role for the Lions, because when he was healthy, he gave you a change of pace from what a guy like James Houston would be. He gave you that explosiveness, that speed, production. Like, he would be fantastic. He was worth the re-signing. But if you think about it, as well as him, Tracy Walker, really Charles Harris, all of these guys that have since gotten those extensions defensively, the biggest deals we've given out on defense, have not really played since they've gotten those extensions. So we hope that Romeo Okwara can come back, look more like himself this year. And if that's the case, amazing. That would be outstanding. He'll probably get some bonuses to that, some incentives for playing, and that would be fantastic for the Lions. But this is a pretty big deal because that's a lot of cap space that the Lions open up. Now, with that being said, I now want to move on to discussing this defense a little bit, just giving you guys some of my thoughts on where I think this defense may be headed based on the moves that we saw made yesterday with Gardner-Johnson signing to the Detroit Lions. I'm going to do my best to kind of get this straight to the point because I don't want this to become super long. Okay, this is somewhat of a breakdown, but at the same time, it's not like super in depth here, and we still haven't done our breakdown videos on Gardner-Johnson, Emmanuel Moseley, those players yet, so I want to do those for sure first before I go like super deep into this. But I have watched all these players to make this video. I've watched a lot of their games to make this type of video. So with that being said, let's start with the front first and kind of my vision on how this is looking. And yes, these will tie together, okay, a little bit. These do tie together, okay, so stick with me through this. But as we know, Aaron Glenn said that defenses, the philosophy is built through the defensive line and really the defensive back, specifically the cornerback position. It's built through those two things. That doesn't mean you can't have any linebackers, right? You got to have linebackers. They're very important to the defense, and the Lions have those with Anzalone, Derek Barnes, Mel Rodriguez, and I assume they'll add another piece through the draft, maybe a little bit more of the third down piece, a little bit more coverage upside, and the guy that can also, I think, bring special teams immediately to the table. So they're going to, I believe, add that throughout the draft, and it could be relatively high, but again, the defense And we've seen it now how the Lions are building this. When they first got here, they started building the defensive line up. That was the first thing that they kind of went after and attacked with Aleem McNeil, Levi this past year coming back, taking Hutchinson, James Houston, taking Josh Paschal, signing John Kaminsky, Isaiah Buggs, Benito Jones, right? Some of these were not maybe something that they planned to do, but because of injuries, we've seen the scheme adjust and change a little bit through these past 2 years. But when you look at the front for the Lions, we know that a lot of times now, 3/4 of the times, teams are sitting in nickel, meaning your base package is basically now playing with 5 defensive backs. That's basically a base package now. It's playing with at least five defensive backs. And we know with the Saints before Aaron Glenn got here and in 2020, their main defense was a 4-2-5 defense. That's what they played out of. They played a lot of 5 defensive backs, and that's where a guy like Gardner-Johnson comes into play because he was their slot at the time. Quick voiceover stat I want to give you guys here. So the Saints actually in 2020, they stood out because they played dime on over 25% of their snaps and still were one of the top run defenses. One thing that made them special as a defense, keep that in mind as we go through this because I'm going to be talking about the run defense as well. And I'm going to make some comparisons here and how I kind of see this coming together. But when you start with the front first, all right, you got to start with those big guys in the interior. See, one thing that made that Saints defense, and I do think there's a lot of similarities to where the Lions are taking this, right? Things change based on injuries. You have to play differently philosophy-wise. See a lot of similarities as well to how the Saints had their defense built in that 2020 season. And one thing with that Saints defense, and we're going to throw some numbers in here, but one thing with that Saints defense is that they had tons of versatility in the back end, which we'll talk about. They had tons of that. But also on the front, one thing with that defense, they were able to stop the run while being able to sit out there with 5 defensive backs. That was huge. They were one of the best run-stopping teams. So a big part of that for them was, believe it or not, the back end. And I brought it up a lot this past season where I felt like our back end, whether that was, containing, missing tackles, whatever that may be, gave up a lot of those big runs. And once we got that kind of locked in, our front, while it wasn't great, it wasn't as bad as it was made out to believe because of the run defense statistics. That was my point that I made a lot this past season. So when I look at the front and how the Lions are building this, clearly they've invested there, right? They re-signed Romeo Okwara when they first got here. They've invested at this position. And you can see some of the names that are thrown up here. Hopefully I'm not missing anybody. I could definitely be missing some players here. But the point is, the main guys, I put them up on the screen here. Now, this was kind of what we saw from the Lions defense this past season when they were in, these 4-man front. We saw the Lions last season. This is one look that they would give you where you had, your 2-eye tech. You had your 2-eye technique here, which would be, your Aleem McNeil, Benito Jones. Now, the difference is that I do want to stop and point out is that through the season, after the bye week, Aleem McNeil became the Detroit Lions 3-tech defensively. The reason he did is because the Lions didn't really have a 3-tech. Levi was injured coming into the year, so that made them have to kind of like recalculate and be like, okay, hold up, we got to go find some girth. So that's why they brought in Benito Jones to like, look, we're going to change this up and play to our size a little bit more because Levi's not healthy as of now. They started with Michael Brockers at the 3 technique. We weren't getting really any production there, so they ultimately just put Aleem McNeil there, and he was able to have some success. He had a really nice pass rushing stretch for the Lions at that position. I don't know if that's still the position that they want him in long term, so here you could say I put him more as a nose tackle, but the point is that there's flexibility and versatility between the two, but being a 3-tech can kind of give you more of that two-way go against a guard to win as a pass rusher. And for the Lions, because Levi wasn't healthy and Brockers wasn't giving us tons of production from there, they put Aleem there. But I think naturally they like him more as that nose tackle. When they draft him, they said, hey, he's the last pure nose tackle on the board. He's just so athletic that he's been able to bounce around for the Lions. And again, this is just an example of kind of that 4-man front. Now, one thing for the Lions is that we saw last year, allowing our edge rushers to stand up became really beneficial, I think, because it was something that Hutch did coming out of college in his last year in Michigan. He seemed to do really well there with us. Not technically then a 4-2-5, it's more of a 2-4-5. It's basically the same kind of idea where instead they're just standing up as edge rushers. But the biggest thing to look out for here, because we know about these edge defenders, is the interior. It's the big dudes. It's the Aleem McNeils. It's the Benito Jones, who had his exclusive rights deal tendered for the Lions. It's Isaiah Buggs, who got re-signed on a 2-year deal, who we know he can start and you can win with him. It's just, to me, I think you really would like him as your backup defensive tackle. That's versatile, but when he's fresh, he is a problem. And he's still very young. He's still figuring it out. And when he's on, he is a really tough thing to deal with. But that's where I focus, because when you look at the Lions defensive front here, where I've brought up many times where I think the Lions need to address is getting that attacking 3-tech. I think it's the biggest hole on this defense. But based on, I think, where things seem like they're starting to pivot for the Lions, they're going to need, I think, some size with that defensive tackle that they add, right? To me, it's got to be a guy that can occasionally handle, the down blocks, getting double teamed. They have to be able to handle those. While the Lions aren't necessarily a two-gapping defense, they do need to have interior guys that can handle those. That's not to say that they can't be under 300 pounds. You can't. Some guys can handle that. If you can handle that, you can handle that. But they have to be able to handle those situations. So naturally, you think of guys that are like 300 pounds. When you look at what the New Orleans Saints had back in 2020 on their defensive front, similar look. David Onyemata, who was a 3-tech that was attacking, and we saw him get signed this offseason, someone that I've talked about. But for him, he was still 300 pounds, right? He still had a lot of size on the inside. And then their nose tackle in their defense was a guy like Malcolm Brown, who was 320, similar size to an Aleem McNeil. So for the Lions, they're keeping a lot of that size. Benito, 315, Aleem McNeil, 320, Bugs, almost 300 pounds. That size, but also a guy that can attack the quarterback. It's not easy to find, but I think that's the Lions' kind of like missing piece on the interior. Now, you also have to keep in mind, we do have a guy like Levi. So if Levi can step into that, he's 295 when we drafted him. He also had size. He just needed to get stronger in the lower body, get more consistent against handling the run. But the frame was definitely there to be a guy that could still hang on the inside, handle double teams occasionally, but also get pressure. Like, he was a guy that's why the Lions considered trading up for, because while it wasn't always there consistently, he had the build to do that consistently. So I think for the Lions, and we're hopeful on Levi, but I think they're going to draft this position. I think you need a guy that you really have to come in and say, man, we think he has enough size to handle those situations. Or if he is undersized, like in Aaron Donald, when he came out, he's listed at 285, but he could handle those. He had a weird build. He was so thick in the lower body, he could sit down, he could handle those situations. He was a smart run defender. So Lions need to have that. But one thing that they put together with this defensive line, and we saw it over this past year, is versatility. Guys that can play a lot of different spots. And that's where you start to get to some of those 5-man front looks, which we showed against teams at the end of the year, like Chicago, Carolina, Green Bay. And against those 5-man looks, specifically teams that really like to run the football, against those 5-man looks, you could see how the Lions defense, this is an example of how it looked this past season. This is where you start to see kind of that 5-tech, 6-tech, 4-eye, 7 technique, like whatever he wants to be based on the situation where he's kind of matched up with the tight end. That's where you get the, commissioner. That's where you get the Josh Pascals. That's where their role comes into play, because in the 4-man front, they're usually kind of used as like a big defensive end that can stand up. And against certain teams and matchups, that's fine. They can do that. That's versatility for us. And when you do that, it also allows a guy like Aiden Hutchinson to flip. So if Aiden Hutchinson wants to go to them the weak side and they want to rush him, they could put one of those big guys on the strong side. If they want to go a little bit lighter and they want to have a guy like Charles out there, or if they want to have a guy like James Houston out there, they could put Hutch back on the strong side if they want to keep him on the field at the same time. Or again, they can flip it. Put the big guys out there, put Hutch then on the weak side. Same kind of idea here, even with the 5-man front. But with the 5-man front, it gives them a little bit more flexibility, especially with those guys that are lighter, like James Houston, because they can kind of play through having that 5 technique next to them, like John Kaminsky, like the Pascals, the guys who can really handle the run responsibilities against tight ends, that allows you to really free up the James Houstons to rush, but also drop in coverage, the Julian Okwaras, the Romeo Okwaras, I even think, to a point here. And then again, on the strong side, you can have your Aiden Hutchinsons, maybe even your Austin Bryants, just because he's still on the roster, right? So that kind of thing. Linebacker, for both of these fronts, we're only talking about 2 off-ball linebackers here, and Malcolm Rodriguez and Alex Anzalone as basically your 2 starters. So again, we did give 3 linebacker looks this past season at times where Chris Board would be out there. We go 3 off-ball linebackers. Your scheme's going to always change and be different based on games, but for the most part, this is kind of what we're looking at, I think, here, based on what we're building and what we believe the philosophy is, hey, you build through cornerback and defensive line. Based on where you invest, you got to get those guys in on the field. If you're going to build through those 2 positions, you don't want 4 off-ball line. You don't want that. That doesn't make any sense. You want those guys in on the field, so you reduce the amount of off-ball linebackers a lot of times to 2, sometimes 1 on passing downs, 2 off-ball linebackers, 4 defensive linemen, maybe 5, depending on who you're playing. And then at the same time, you're extending how many DBs you're also getting on the field because you're investing in that. Clearly, this offseason, in free agency, what they went after is kind of similar to what the Saints did. It's the Saints, what they did when they built that thing. They addressed it 2, they built through defensive line and cornerback position. Now, they did theirs through draft. The Lions have done that with the defensive front. The difference is here is that the Lions are now addressing a lot of those defensive back needs through free agency in terms of they're getting guys that are somewhat proven. Like, they've proven that they can play. Some of them, like Moseley, more of a prove-it deal, but Sutton's proven that he can play. So you're getting prove-it guys now, because I think it's one of those situations where you're like, hey, this is bad. This needs to get turned around. The numbers are not good here. This needs to get better. So you're getting proven guys, and I still believe they'll draft a corner on top of that. When we start to talk about the defensive backfield, we just talked about the front, how I think they'll kind of look for that DT. Now when you talk about the defensive backs, this is where things get really interesting for the Detroit Lions, okay? Here are some of my comparisons that I put together on the bottom, but this is just an idea of where I think this is going to look at. So I made my Cam Sutton video. I talked about how I really like the potential of him to play the slot. Now that's still not something that's off the table. Why? Because versatility, because you're not really going to come into a season with everybody healthy. It just doesn't happen. Unfortunately, it's not how it works out. You love to look at things on paper, but it's a physical sport that guys have to move all the time. So it's never a problem to have guys that can play multiple positions. So I'm assuming Sutton can still play that role for the Lions. But just based on what Gardner-Johnson has done in his past and watching his film, one thing that I didn't love about Sutton from the slot, one of my biggest concerns, was mainly the fact of his size and his build and his ability to shed blocks. That was going to be something that he was going to lack a little bit from that position. So he was almost more of like a coverage slot corner, but he didn't have some of that, just power against the run. Gardner-Johnson now, who is 200 plus pounds, does have that, and he has really good coverage skills as well, right? He's not maybe elite in that category, but he can really cover from that position. He had a lot of practice with the New Orleans Saints. So this is kind of an idea of how I'm kind of like looking at it, how this thing could kind of be put together. Now, let me share some of my comparisons here from 2023 and how this cornerback room is starting to come together, and also the safety position. Of course, you have Tracy, Iffy, then you have Kirby Joseph, and more. The Saints back in 2020 is what we saw is in that defense, it was very man heavy, but also a lot of safety movement post snap, which is what the Lions have done as well. A lot of safety movement. So sometimes you get 2-man looks, sometimes you get cover 1 looks, but a lot of safety movement. So for your DBs, your corners, how do you get productive in man coverage? Because it's difficult. It's difficult to make plays in man because you're playing your man, especially press man. It's very difficult to make a lot of plays on the ball. So the way that you do that and you get productive, kind of like to what Aaron Glenn brought up, yes, you be aggressive at the line. You can do that. But also, you play off your help. You have to know, when is the sideline my help? When do I have safety help? When do I have linebacker help? Based on the coverage that we're playing. If I have 2 deep safeties, I can get more aggressive underneath. I can look to undercut routes. Do I have a middle field safety? Am I playing my help of the sideline? If I'm playing the sideline, now I can try to force him to the outside. So you're on an island, but you're also not on an island at the same time, ideally, because you're also having that safety help that's just moving all the time. Sometimes they roll down, one drops deep. Now you play off of that. The inside guys can play to that help that's rolling down. The outside guys can squeeze to the sideline. Some of the comparisons that I made here, just based on the player types, right? I kind of put them into their own like categories. And then I also compared them to what I saw from the Saints and how they had their cornerback room built, right? In 2020, they had him a little bit for 2019. They had a guy named Janoris Jenkins who they brought in. It wasn't there for a long term, but it helped them put together one of the best back ends in football because he was a really nice pairing with Marshawn Lattimore, who we already knew was a dog, and he was another all-pro that season or a Pro Bowler. So I compare him to Cam Sutton. Why? Let's talk about it. Athletically, Janoris Jenkins, not the most athletically, gifted cornerback. Good athlete, don't get me wrong, but where he made his money, especially coming out of college, was not that he was the most explosive or the fastest athlete, but or the biggest athlete, but instead, it was more so the fact that he was very fluid, really good hips. It's the same things that I said about Cam Sutton in his video that I really liked. He wasn't the most explosive or dynamic athlete, but instead he was so fluid as a corner, where really you could see it show up in off coverage. You could see those things. The long speed was questionable. So again, like they were, maybe even a little bit to a lesser degree with Jenkins, you're going to still have to be matchup aware when he's on the outside, but from off coverage, when you have in those spots, it's great. Cam Sutton is a very smart cornerback, which is the overarching theme that I need to make present here. Smart cornerbacks are so important in this defense. Why? One of the biggest weaknesses of man coverage is, one, running across the field, right? That's why you got to play to your help, because it's hard to cover a lot of field in man coverage. But 2, it's the crossing route. It's forcing you to switch things. It's forcing you to communicate. When you can't communicate and switch routes, it's very difficult to stay in man coverage and play a lot of man coverage, because then people are just running by each other and you're getting lost and 2 guys are covering 1. You have to be able to communicate. That is something that the Lions have now acquired. Number 1, clearly with Cam Sutton. Very smart back-end player. Communicates really well. There's never breakdown. I found one breakdown. I showed you guys that. That was it. Very good communicator in the back end. So the Lions gaining that, whether that's inside or outside, is very important, because the Saints, they switch everything. They switch a lot in man coverage, right? Whether that's passing it to the safety in my help, now I'm dropping off into zone coverage. Whether that's switching the route with you in the red zone, switching, communication. Sutton is really good at that. He's one of the smartest defensive backs, right? Coaches have said that about him. So that's something that he brings to the table. Same thing with Gardner-Johnson. Very smart corner. He was a part of that. He had to play safety, he had to play slot. You have to be able to communicate. So that's huge because it's something that Don always talked about is when you're just playing man coverage, it's what's your skills in man. But in man, a very big weakness is having to switch off routes unless you can communicate. And when you can pass off everything, because everybody's versatile, you can play inside, you can play outside, he can play inside, he can play outside. Now all of a sudden it's very tough to find openings because everybody's passing it off. It's like basketball. When everybody's switching, it's like, oh, they're switching everything. You can't switch everything if you can't match up. But when you have matchup pieces across the board, you can start to switch everything. Now it's difficult to find openings in the defense because it's hard to find a complete mismatch. Now I separated the Lions' current players in their own categories. Okudah, Moseley, Jacobs. I view those guys as the physical, get up in you, get under your chin, press you off the line of scrimmage, can really play press. Now that's not to say they can't play off coverage. I just got through watching some more Moseley. Dude can play off coverage, right? He's a really good athlete. I compared him, as you see, to a guy like Lattimore. I'm not saying Emmanuel Mosley's Marshawn Lattimore. That would be insane. I'm not saying that. But based on their build and their athletic skill set, I put them together. Marshawn Lattimore came out of college, 6 foot, 193. Emmanuel Moseley came out of college, 5'11", 190. Okay, similarities there. How about the athletic testing? Emmanuel Moseley. Now, this was at a pro day because he was an undrafted guy. He wasn't a top pick. But at his pro day, he posted a 4.4 240. Impressive. A 1.51 10-yard split, impressive, and a 38.5-inch vertical. Look at the comparison between that and Lattimore. Lattimore ran a 4.3 640. Really, I mean, that's a special time, of course. A 1.49 10-yard split, similar there, and then the same exact vertical. Talking about a way better athlete to me, just in terms of testing numbers, than a guy like Cam Sutton or than a Janoris Jenkins. So that's why I put him more in kind of that category of a guy that's more physical, ultra aggressive when you watch him. He's a big hitter, but he needs to get more consistent there. But he's really aggressive, right? So you're getting, I think, kind of a guy like that that's willing to get up on you off the line of scrimmage. So I kind of put them all to their own category. I flip it and I put Sutton with a guy like Chase Lucas. Guys that can play a lot of off coverage, can also kick into the slot. But those guys, more of your, I win with my fluidity in coverage. I win with my smarts in coverage, right? Lucas comes out, proven vet, right? This guy he's 25 years old, right, when he's coming out, right? He's played a lot of football. So he's a little bit different because we haven't seen much of him. But specifically Cam Sutton, that's why I compare him to Janoris Jenkins. Not the most dynamic athlete, but he's a smart corner. You have to be aware of matchups I put him in. Am I giving him help? If I'm not giving help, do we play off coverage? Are we blitzing? Can he get aggressive when we blitz? Yes, right? Who am I matching him up with? Are we in the red zone? Now I can get more aggressive. You have to be matchup aware with him because he can get beat over top, and we've seen that, and I said that in the video. You got to be matchup aware with him. He can play outside, however, but you just have to be aware of the situation to put him in. So those are my two comparisons. Chauncey Gardner-Johnson compared to CJ Gardner-Johnson. I mean, it's the same guy, right? These guys are comparing to themselves. Physical slot, willing to get up on you, can match up with tight ends, play the run, and he's a really, really nice blitzer. So this is a lot of the things that I thought Sutton didn't bring to the position, Gardner-Johnson brings to the position. He is like your typical guy that's just going to get in your head. Now, here's a great example. So we talked about Jalen and how he feels like he's the best player. He's going to talk to you. He's going to let you hear about it. Gardner-Johnson's the same way. Difference, though, here's an example. You could see him getting punched in the face by a Chicago receiver. This is what he does. He's an instigator. He talks all the time. I saw plays where he would miss the tackle and someone else would make it and the guy would be short, and he was the guy that talked to the receiver. Like, I did that. It's like, dude, you missed the tackle. But he's that guy. He's going to get under your skin. He's got that nasty from a slot. He's also a big-time playmaker. That's what he is. He's a guy that's going to get under your skin, frustrate you, but also stay under control as a player. So that's what you're getting from that position. And then he moved to safety. Versatility is key here, but one thing that we saw with that defense in New Orleans, you had Marcus Williams, who was your really good free safety. A lot of times that was his role. Play deep, be the ball hawk in the back. And Kirby's already proven that he's that. So I compared those two. Tracy Walker and Malcolm Jenkins. Malcolm rolled a lot in the box, matched up on tight ends a ton. That I'm comparing to Tracy. He's more of your downhill. He's more of your hitter. Not to say he can't play deep, and he will, but he's more of that piece for the Lions. And then, of course, again, the Lions' versatility here is becoming very clear. From Cam Sutton all the way to an Ife Melifonwu or a Will Harris, the flexibility is becoming very clear that these guys can play inside, outside, safety, match up on tight ends. Lions have matchup pieces for everything. If he can match up on tight ends and running backs on third down, you're getting a lot of matchup pieces now in the back end, and that's crucial if you're going to switch. You need smart guys that can communicate. Why is Will Harris back? Why is Will Harris back? Because he communicates. He's one of the smartest defensive backs that we have. That's why he's here, because the Lions can trust him. We put him in slot, put him on outside. We know he's limited. We know there's certain things that's not natural for him, but we also know that he's going to tell the other guy where I'm going to be. And you know where he's going to be. There's not going to be breakdowns on his side. That's why he's back to spots. We know what he's limited and what he's good at, what he's not good at, but we also know that there's not going to be breakdowns going his way. And he's willing to compete against the run, like everyone basically is that I'm showing you here. Because as we talked about a lot last year, I was like, man, a lot of issues I feel like against the run is happening on the outside. Everybody wants to blame the interior, it's all their fault. Yes, it wasn't always great, but a lot of times to me, it was sometimes we were in bad positions schematically, 100%, Seattle, but also a lot of times issues with contain. Guy would break contain, the corners wouldn't get out there and force it back inside. We miss a tackle. Okuda, remember the one against Carolina, big run, right? Things like that. I do think even the statistics, you can have a reason to be optimistic about the Lions' ability to stop the run from the interior. And this is something that we broke down more specifically during the season. We looked at the All-22, what were the real issues at stopping the run. And as I said, there were times where it was the interior. But even when you just take a look at the statistics alone, you go game by game, you can note how many issues came outside of that for the Lions. When those things were dialed in, how good we were, whether that was maybe not having a mobile quarterback to deal with, because then we wouldn't have to worry about as much of containing the run inside. It was more so a lot of things were happening inside, and they were able to shut the run down. If you go game by game really quickly, and I always use week 9 on, Jerry Jacobs returned at this time, and he really started playing for us, so we had a number 2 cornerback. Kaminsky was returning around this time. But you start off with the Green Bay Packers, right? 25 carries, 106 yards, which isn't terrible, but also you got to keep on 40 of those yards, where guess what? Aaron Rodgers. Okay, now sometimes the quarterback gets a broken play late, sometimes it's a design run, which was a lot more of the case with Chicago. 35 carries, 258. Not going to look great on the stat sheet, but it's also important to remember that they didn't put up a lot of passing yards against us because they ran the ball so much. And also on top of that, you just had those big runs. You had a couple big runs both times that we played Chicago, which really shot those numbers up for the Bears in those games. I mean, 147 of those 258 came from Fields. But then you had teams like the Giants, who you shut down Saquon Barkley as a team, 26 for 89. But again, Saquon was 15 carries for 22 yards. That was outstanding. You had the Buffalo Bills, right? 29 carries, 164 here. Again, a really nice chunk of that, over 70 of those yards, came from Josh Allen. You look at the Jaguars game. Now, this is where we kind of helped ourselves out here by scoring so many points. Helps you out because you can force the other team to stop running the football. That's kind of what happened here to Jacksonville to hold them under 100 yards. But Minnesota, who's given us a lot of problems, as a team was 17 for 22. There was no threat for Kirk Cousins to run the ball, so it didn't stress anybody in the back end. It was more so in the front. Again, a lot of their zone runs, and the Lions handled it. This was a game I brought up a lot of the time, specifically last year, where the first time I played Minnesota wasn't great. The zone runs, all the cutbacks that they do, you have to be able to contain. The second time, we contained much better. All of a sudden, we shut down the run game for them. The Jets, 22 carries, 50 yards in that game as well. Then you move on to Carolina, 320. These are like outliers, well, sort of, that are jacking up the stats. But again, Carolina was a few key like monster runs. Now there was bad all around. We did an all-22 breakdown. Feel free to check that out. I know it's during the season. But the point is that in this one, you had the missed tackle on the edge on the outside that broke a big run. We had like a few huge runs in this game. And then again, Chicago, 22 carries, 200 yards. Fields was the majority of this. But again, they didn't put up a lot of passing yards. So these ones don't really concern me too much. Less carries in this one because of the fact that we were beating them so bad. And then you had the Green Bay Packers again, 28 for 103. So it can definitely get better. It's got to get better. But it's not like it's something that's like, oh, we're so far away from being able to stop the run. And I think this is a very underrated part. Like, Chauncey Gardner-Johnson is a tone setter. He may miss a few tackles, but he will fight off blocks from the slot like a guy like Will and Mike Hughes did for us. You have a guy like Cam Sutton, who's incredible at limiting yards after catch. Just precise tackles. Now, Moseley, on the other hand, he's super aggressive, but at the same time, Moseley also, I think, just misses way too many tackles, so that needs to be cleaned up. But the emphasis on the secondary, helping as a run defense, should not be overlooked. Now, the third down stats, they're maybe not as optimistic. I mean, now the last 3 games this season, the Lions had the best third down defense and conversion rate allowed, under 30%, which is great. Some of that was the fact that, again, teams didn't attempt a ton against us. For example, Green Bay was 4 for 12, Chicago was 3 for 13, Carolina was 3 for 9, but they beat us, and that's because they had so many big plays early that we just kind of fell in a hole. Outside of those 3 games, though, it still wasn't great, but the run defense, definitely reason to be optimistic. I'm not trying to call anybody out, but I'm making the point of this is a unit that becomes very critical, because while you are trying to build that size and keep that girth on the interior based on what you have now with Buggs coming back, and you have the big physical, edge rushers that if you only want to put a 4-man front, you could put a guy guy like Kaminsky out there, similar to a Cam Jordan who's 280, John Kaminsky, Josh Paschal, big edge rusher. You can put them out there at defensive end and play that four-man front. So you're getting that flexibility, the same flexibility that the Saints had. It was a key word. PFF even said it. This is a versatile defense. That made them spectacular on defense. That's what the Lions are currently putting together. And now they're getting proven guys in the back end that can do that. Now, let me throw some statistics at you, while at the same time, I also could show you what an example of a NASCAR package the Lions could utilize. Now, I say this in terms of these names and alignments aren't really important here. Guys are going to move around, but this is kind of what the Saints did in 2020, is they would like to walk up their linebackers on guards, and then they'd match up the tackles and centers. This opened up a ton of stunt flexibility. Lions were outstanding at setting up stunts and things like that this past season. But, of course, then in the back end, you have to be reliable. When you are reliable in the back end, you trust that you can match up different pieces in different spots. You have different matchups for everybody across the board. That way you can play man and get aggressive. But at the same time, you also know that they're going to communicate and not get broken on a quick little slant flat and then two guys are covering one and the guy's wide open. If that's going to happen, you can't get aggressive because you can't trust them in the back end to hold their own. Now you're starting to be able to trust these guys because you have a lot of smart people on this defensive back end. You have a lot of smart coaches on the field. That's why they paid Tracy the big bucks, because he was smart. He communicated. He ran the stuff defensively. That's why they paid him. I'm going to end up bringing up this play here in a second, but I might as well show it now because it fits to what I'm talking about. This is what the Lions love to do on third down. And after seeing it for 2 straight years, I don't anticipate this is going to go anywhere. You can see on this play, this time A.J. Parker, he just bit a little bit too hard and he got ran by. I'm not saying that this wasn't easy to defend, but it is an example that I wanted to bring up. If this is the thing that the Lions like to do, it's also what the Saints did as well, is they'll play off man and they may bring the house. And we've gotten beat on that a few times. Different teams, different matchups, Carolina, outside, inside. This is an example of the kind of pieces that you could put out there. Let me throw you some statistics. This is where 2 areas I focused on here where I think the Lions clearly pointed to we have to get better. Number 1, pressuring the quarterback. I couldn't find all the stats that I wanted to, but let me give you some examples. So, Lions showed improvement here last year. They blitzed 31.2% of the time, which was a raise from 27.3% this past year. I think that shows some of the more trust that they had to bring pressure in those situations. The great thing is that the Lions went from 29th in pressure rate. Now, this is just every down, but they went from 29th in pressure rate to 9th in pressure rate as a team. That is a really nice jump up to 23.2%. But still, if you compare it to a team like the Saints, who in 2020 blitzed only 31.8% of the time, a little bit more than we did this past year because they trusted everybody in the back end, but they also were 6th in pressure rate at 26.3%. I think the Lions are trying to get better there because when you're better there, you're really tough on third down. And that is where the Lions have been terrible. Let's just put it out there. Lions have been terrible at getting off the field. They've also been pretty bad at getting teams in this spot, okay? They've had the 4th least amount of opportunities on third down in the league the last 2 years, which is not great. But what's worse is that the Lions aren't getting teams off the field at a high level. Almost 50% teams are converting against them these last 2 years. It's literally the exact same percentage the last 2 years. 45% of the time, teams are converting against them on third down. That's 30th this past year and 29th the year before. Compare that to that Saints team in 2020 that on third down allowed 38.2% conversion rate. That's 9th in the league and 207 attempts, which is more in 16 games than we have gotten teams into in the past 2 years in 17 games. To put in context how much the Saints brought the pressure on third down, 38% of the time they allowed a conversion on third down. But 40% of third down defensively snaps, they brought pressure. They brought a blitz, 5 or more rushers. Also, keep in mind this past season, the Lions only had 1 interception on third down, which is tied for last in the league. Now, the year before, Amani had 4 himself, but obviously that wasn't the case this past year. All right, that was top half of the league. We've been at the near bottom in getting teams into third down. So all these things tie together. And just for fun, I looked at the last 5 Super Bowl winners. Well, it's not they're always the top third down defense that wins the Super Bowl. You can see that there's only one team in the last 5 years, and that was the Rams, that were below average, below the middle of the pack at stopping teams on third down that actually won the Super Bowl. They were 21st at 41.3%. Still basically 4% lower than what we have allowed the last 2 years. But the Chiefs, they were 13th, 38%. That's a 7% difference. That's huge. 2020, right? You had the Bucks, 40%. They were 14th in the league. 2019, 37%. That was 11th in the league. 2018, the Patriots, 38.6%. That was 16th. So it doesn't mean that you have to be the best team on third down, but you got to get teams off the field. And that's something where I think the Lions probably circled and said, look, man, this is a problem, because you can literally think of exact examples, whether it's third down or fourth down, where you can remember the Lions didn't get off the field. They didn't have a playmaker to get off the field. Maybe they had a breakdown in coverage. Whatever it may be, someone was exploited. They found a matchup they liked. We showed blitz because the Lions clearly are not afraid to show it. It's something that I, was upset about last year, but if you're going to do it, you have to be able to make the play. Like, if you're going to show everybody across the line and just play off man in the back end, and the team can say, okay, we like this matchup, that guy better be able to hold his own, because if he can't, the ball's going right there. And that was something that kept killing the Lions last season. Miami comes to mind twice. Back later, and they picked up a conversion which sealed the game. Why did this not happen last year? Well, we were still in a different stage of building the team. Again, through the draft, the focus was more defensive line: Hutchinson, Josh Paschal, James Houston. So we were still putting that together. Also, we acquired our safety, and we acquired a starting off-ball linebacker. So we were trying to figure out other spots as well. We were still working through that. Duracell is that consistent piece that can play different spots for us at off-ball linebacker, and that's something that the Saints also did, was go sign free agent linebackers to hold it down, whether that be Demario Davis or Alex Anzalone. So they had the same guy there, a lot of connection. However, last year the Lions came into, I think, wanting to see what they had. Jeff Okudah, it was the first full year that he played, so they got a sense of what they have there. Amani was coming off a good year. There's no reason not to play the guy, but it was bad this past year. Addressed other positions. Quinton Dunbar, right? It didn't work. You tried to give a prove-it deal. Unfortunately, hoping for the best for him. I still don't know what was going on off the field, but he didn't play for you this past season. So you didn't address it as heavy, right? Chase Lucas, 7th-round pick. He didn't really play. You didn't address it as heavy. Mike Hughes got a 1-year deal. Tried him at slot. Didn't love it, so you put him on the outside. But the slot came up as issues because it was a very big projection for him, and he was having some communication breakdowns there. When he put him on the outside, he looked more natural because he can cover. The guy can cover. It's just he's a little bit limited on the outside, and on top of that, the communication wasn't up to par for what they were looking for, so they had some breakdowns when he was out there. Now, I'm not going to say I didn't like Mike Hughes. I did like Mike Hughes, and I was cool with bringing him back, but the point is, they just hit it a little bit less as hard this year. This year with more financial flexibility, because their defensive line is already now coming together through the draft. They said, okay, we addressed those things this past year. We're going to probably have to hit our DT in the draft. I still believe could be the top pick, but now we have to come back and start hitting the secondary, and we're going to get proven guys. We're not playing around with this. We know we got to get some proven guys back here, and they've now hit 3 of those guys, basically, one of them coming off an injury, but they basically brought in 3 proven guys in the back end now that have already proven we can play. Like, we can play. We've shown that for multiple years. I think they'll still probably hit it in the draft, trying to find a potential guy that could turn into a number 1. I think they'll draft an outside corner. It's kind of charting all the different coverages that these guys were in, trying to get a sense of what coverage did they play, what did they do defensively. Like a guy like Moseley, I had a lot of cover 3, a lot of cover 4, some cover 6 mixed in there. So a lot of, off alignment, zone alignments, things like that. Like, the guys can all play zone coverage. You get a lot of Tampa 2 from a lot of these guys. We talked about Sutton, his ability to play safety, line up in the slot, do it, play outside underneath, play a lot of that. Manuel Moseley did the same thing. He played a lot of Tampa 2. Now, Moseley, he was always basically on the outside, so it's a little bit different. But even then, he showed versatility there. He dropped to a safety alignment from the outside, showing like an inverted Tampa 2 look. Gardner-Johnson, he's played all those spots, and he's done the same thing in the Tampa 2 defense. He's played a lot of different spots. He's going to play all different types of positions, lining up inside, outside, safety, slot. A lot of resemblance to me of that 2020 team. And if it goes that direction, I believe Lions will draft an outside corner for more competition, maybe a guy with some more tools out there, but at the same time, guy that doesn't necessarily maybe have to be ready right now to be your top corner, but can potentially develop into that. And I think they'll go DT, which I think could be their top pick, a guy that you can believe can handle those runs, because you're not looking to 2-gap, but you do need to have a guy that you think can hold his own against double teams, because if he's going to get washed out, it's going to be hard to put him out there. And if the Lions are going to play some of these lighter boxes like the Saints did, they had one of the top run defense. Didn't mean they had the most guys in the box, but they had versatility across the board. And if you're going to do that, the secondary has to be able to hold their own, but you also need guys in the interior that aren't going to get washed out. And based on the personnel they have, it makes sense to go that direction. Also keep in mind, though, a lot of these deals, John Kaminsky, Isaiah Buggs, what do they have in common? They have outs after a year. So we know schemes change from year to year. Things change. Like, okay, we have this, we like this, we're going to change it up a little bit. Point, though, Lions have outs after this year with Kaminsky, after Buggs. We don't know what it's going to look like next year. Lions could be like, we like doing this a little bit more, so now we have outs. I think that's a big part of the reason you also leave outs in deals, because now the Lions understand that. We've seen the last 2 years, we've had to change things schematically as the season went on. So while I think there's a vision now, we'll see where it's at when the season starts. We've seen that things change from year to year, and it definitely could after this year. But right now, this is where I see things starting to trend. With that being said, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you, Bob, for watching, and I'm out.